Let us pray.
Oh, well, okay, fine.
Great Architect of the universe, we thank you for this day that you provided for us. We thank you for this opportunity to come and learn more about our fraternity, to learn about its goals, its history, and its principles. We ask thy blessing upon this Scottish Rite body and on the Valley of Phoenix and on the people who are governing the various bodies. Be with us this evening. Open our hearts and minds to receive the instructions that we're about to receive. This we ask in thy name's sake. Amen.
Let it be. Yeah. Good.
Thank you. I'm delighted with the turnout, especially on a short notice. I was looking for maybe 20 or 30 guys, and
Over here.
yeah, so there's 20 over here, and there's 30 over here, and another 30 here, and it's really good to see this many of you, especially on a nice cool day in July. I'm going to ask Rick Driver to come up and introduce our guest speaker. Rick and Robert have been friends for several years, close friends, and I think it's very appropriate. Rick can probably tell us some interesting tales about Robert that he may not want everybody to hear, but could be fun. So with no further ado, Rick, would you come on up and introduce our speaker for us?
Don't worry, Bob, I wouldn't tell him anything.
You better not.
Yeah, right. One of the most remarkable characteristics about our craft, Freemasonry, is its ability to facilitate relationships. Relationships for people that otherwise maybe wouldn't meet in their normal daily lives. My relationship with Robert Cooper this evening is probably very emblematic of that characteristic of the craft, that it somehow affected a very cherished and valued relationship between myself and Robert halfway around the globe. Very unique capability of our craft. Bob serves the Grand Lodge of Scotland in Edinburgh as the curator of its internationally renowned museum and library. He's a noted historian, author, and lecturer. You might even recognize him from some of his many appearances on the Learning Channel, the History Channel, a lot of specials with regards to the craft of Freemasonry and related subjects. Cracking the Freemasons Code, The Renaissance Hoax, and The Masonic Magician are three of Bob's latest books that have been bestsellers among the craft. He's got a new book coming out before the end of the year, I believe, by the name of The Red Triangle, which will be published by the Lewis Masonic Publishing Company in London, England. Bob is the immediate past master of Scotland's very distinguished and oldest lodge of research, Lodge Sir Robert Morey in Edinburgh. He's past master of Lodge Edinburgh Castle.
Yeah.
He's currently junior warden of the world's premier research lodge, Quater Coronati in London, England. Like many of you, Bob has received Masonic honors within our craft, far too numerous for me to try to enumerate today. But probably most important to me is Bob has been my most trusted and valued friend over 15 years. His friendship honors me more than I can say. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Bob, give him a hot Arizona welcome.
Yeah. That's good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Rick, and your preceding comments, John. It's always a delight to be amongst friends, and I have very many friends here whom I've met over the years. Russ, of course, many others. and I don't want to name them all, but I hope to make many more new ones. As to the heat, yes, it's 59 and raining back home, and I kind of wish I was back there just a little bit. But I'm only here for another few days, so I'll be back to normal next week. What I propose doing this evening is telling you a little bit about Scottish Freemasonry and why it's different, and then perhaps discuss a little bit more as to what makes Scottish Freemasonry, particularly at Grand Lodge level, so different from that which exists everywhere else in the world. So in other words, what I'm suggesting to you is the whole world is out of step with Scotland. And if you sort of keep that in mind as we go through this, then I think you'll probably get a fairly good handle on what it is I've got to tell you. The reason why Scottish Freemasonry is so very different is essentially because of its very different history. And oddly enough, that different history manifests itself here in the United States of America, and that's one of the major points I want to explain to you this evening, because I think not only does it explain Scottish Freemasonry, but the American connection is very important and unfortunately virtually unknown. That's going to be the first part of my talk. The second part, as I say, we'll go on and talk about perhaps a little bit more controversially on a variety of matters. And I'd like to sort of thank the Scottish Rite for placing me in this particular hall, because it always impresses me in terms of the organisational ability of the Scottish Rite to place an enormous clock so that the speaker just can't possibly miss the fact that the time is moving on. So I promise I'll not keep you here for an enormously long time. But once I've finished speaking, I think John has very graciously said that you can ask me some questions. Whether or not you get an answer is another matter, but you can certainly ask questions after my delivery. So let's turn to the first part. Now I'm going to be quoting a variety of dates and names and things. They're not really all that important. They're almost little signposts for me in my mind to keep me on track. So don't worry. I mean, it is a bit of a history lesson, but the dates and what have you are not that terribly important. However, having said that, I'm going to hit you with one right away. 1717. Most Masonic historians and most Freemasons who have read anything about Freemasonry will know that Freemasonry began, that is modern speculative Freemasonry, began in London, England in 1717. And of course I'm here to explain to you that that's a load of rubbish. So I'll begin with a more important date for you, and that is 1680. And the reason 1680 is very important is because that was the year that the first known Freemason, that is in the modern sense of the word, the first known Freemason came to the United States, or what is now the United States of America. And this man is known by the name of John Skene. He came from Aberdeen, and he was a member of the Lodge of Aberdeen. Now it's very important, I think, to remember that when we're talking about Scottish Freemasonry or Scottish lodges, pre-1717 in particular, we're not talking about Masonic lodges that we'd recognise today. We're talking about lodges that were made up almost entirely of stonemasons, but with a few exceptions, such as myself and people like yourself, who were allowed, who had the privilege of joining the stonemasons in their lodges. The Lodge at Aberdeen was slightly different because only 20% of the membership in 1670, when their records begin, only 20% of the membership was made up of stonemasons. So in other words, by far the largest majority were not working stonemasons. And this chap, John Skene, was one of those non-stonemasons. He was a merchant. He fled to New Jersey to escape religious persecution in 1680, and we know that he was there. He settled, and forgive my pronunciation, the Ratiarian river, he settled on the north side of that river and founded what is now known as Perth Amboy, originally known as Perth, the ancient capital of Scotland. He was joined a few years later by a guy called John Coburn. He arrived in 1684. Now, he was also a member of a lodge, and he came from a lodge in Melrose, which is in the Scottish borders, and he was a stonemason. The lodge was made up entirely of stonemasons. There was nobody like you and I in this lodge. They were all working stonemasons. They built the abbeys and the castles of the Scottish borders, and that's all they did. So this was a stonemasons lodge. He arrived in New Jersey. He goes to Perth Amboy. He finds this fellow Scot there from Aberdeen by the name of John Skene, and he goes, oh dear, it's typical, you know, come all this way, and what do I find? A Scotsman. You know? So he wasn't prepared to stay in Perth, and he skipped south across the river, where he founded the town of Melrose, after his hometown. Now, how do we know about this? Well, quite simply, John Coburn from Melrose wrote back to Scotland saying, look, this is a great place. You should come and emigrate here. This is to the lodge. You should come and emigrate here because it's a great country. There's all sorts of opportunities, especially for stonemasons. And eventually he started talking to this guy, Skene from Aberdeen. And this is of the crucial importance, I think. Here you have a speculative Freemason, Skene from Aberdeen, and you have a stonemason, Coburn from Melrose. And they get together and they start building projects in New Jersey. So the first stone buildings in that part of the world, in that part of the United States, were the product of a Freemason come stonemason. And this is how Scottish Freemasonry is different from anywhere else in the world. Freemasonry and stonemasonry are virtually one and the same, especially in this particular point in time. So that connection between the actual craft of building castles and palaces and all the rest of it begins very early in Scotland, but the story I want to tell you about is how that came to be developed here in the United States of America. So we have this very first example, if you like, of Freemasonry, that is speculative Freemasonry, connecting to stonemasons and building some of the first stone buildings in North America, in the United States indeed. So if you can bear in mind that that separation between stonemasonry and Freemasonry never really ceased to exist in Scotland, then you begin to understand why Scottish Freemasonry has a completely different flavour, for want of a better description. So these two guys, the first known Freemasons, stonemasons in the world, arrived here in the 1680s in the United States of America. Now, this is a long time before the Grand Lodge of England was founded in 1717. And one of the problems that a Masonic historian has is trying to explain to people that after 300 years of propaganda, or 300 years of saying the same thing over and over again, trying to undo that becomes incredibly difficult. So purely speculative Freemasonry, in that sense, did begin in 1717. What I'm suggesting to you here is that you have to take into account the craft of stonemasonry as well as Freemasonry, and then you can begin to push back the dates many, many hundreds of years. But for the purposes of tonight, we're talking about principally the United States of America. However, I'm going to skip forward a little bit and talk to you about the formation or the foundation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and that happened in 1736. And what happened was, in the United Kingdom, in the British Isles, the Grand Lodge of England had been founded in 1717, the Grand Lodge of Ireland in 1725, and the Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1736. But here I am telling you all about lodges that pre-existed the Grand Lodge system, in Scotland at least, and yet Scotland was the last country to found its own Grand Lodge. Now, that seems a bit odd, but the reason for that is actually fairly simple. When the people who were founding the Grand Lodge of Scotland issued invitations to the lodges all over Scotland to come to the inaugural meeting, they discovered that there were over 100 lodges in existence, whereas in London, England, there was only 4. So it was fairly easy to manage the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England with only 4 lodges. Those 4 lodges supplied all the Grand Lodge officers, etc., etc. In Scotland, with 100 lodges, it was a completely different ballgame. What happened was that the 100 invitations were issued, and of the 100, 33, and you notice all the numerology symbolism coming in here, of the 100 lodges that were invited, only 33 sent representatives. Of the 33, 12 listened to what was going on and decided they wanted nothing to do with the Grand Lodge of Scotland. So in other words, 21 lodges in Scotland thought a Grand Lodge, a head office, was a great idea. Or to put it round the other way, 79% of all Scottish lodges thought a Grand Lodge was not something they wanted to get involved in at all. So that kind of tells you a little bit about the attitude of the Scottish lodges. However, when you look at the membership of these 3 groups, you begin to get a clue as to why. The 21% who supported the formation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland were almost entirely speculative, modern speculative Freemasons, just like us. The 12 who came along and listened were Stonemasons Lodges, which had a lot of non-stonemasons amongst them, but the traditions of stonemasons were very strong. And that's why they didn't want any part of this newfangled Grand Lodge system. The remaining percentage, they were all Stonemasons Lodges, and they just didn't see any point in getting involved with a Grand Lodge. And when you think about it, you can understand the Grand Lodge of Scotland was, or any Grand Lodge, was an entirely speculative body, interested in ritual, interested in initiations, interested in processing people and money and documentation, etc. It had nothing at all to do with stonemasons. It couldn't find them contracts, it couldn't find them work, it could not lay down minimum wages, it could not negotiate building contracts with anyone. So you can understand why the stonemasons of Scotland didn't want anything at all to do with a Grand Lodge. However, that created a big problem for the people who were determined to have a Grand Lodge in Scotland. Just like in England and Ireland, they wanted their own Grand Lodge. So what they did was, in order to try and get these lodges to join this newfangled Grand Lodge system, they said to all these lodges, look, don't worry about losing your independence. We're not going to impose upon you any kind of heavyweight bureaucracy or any heavy rules and regulations. So what happened was they were told, you will be able to carry on using the regalia that you're using in your local area. So if you had a lodge in Inverness that was wearing blue regalia, they were allowed to continue wearing blue regalia. If it was in Dumfries on the other side of the country, they were allowed to continue using green regalia, and so on. As well as that, they were also allowed to continue using whatever ritual they decided to use. And so, again, Inverness might have a completely different ritual from the lodge in Dumfries. So if you allow all the lodges that pre-existed the foundation of Grand Lodge, and remember we're talking about Scotland here, you're darn tooting that every lodge that's founded after 1736 wants exactly the same privileges as all the other lodges had. So that's why to this day, every lodge in Scotland, or every Scottish lodge, wherever it is in the world, has the right to devise its own ritual. There is no such thing as a standard Scottish ritual. But Scotland being Scotland, we have a thing called the standard Scottish ritual. Okay? There we are. But there is no such thing. I mean, when my lodge, the lodge of which I'm past master, was founded in the early 1990s, one of the first things they did was form a committee that sat down and actually started to write the ritual from scratch. And you can imagine, because all the founder members were from different lodges, they all had their favourite bits of ritual, so it just went on and on forever. If we'd actually published the third degree, it would have taken 5 hours to actually convey. So anyway, that's the kind of problems you have. And just as a wee example, just to show you just how different Scottish regalia could be, that's a master mason, a past master's apron from a Scottish lodge. And that's why, as I say, Scots will never give up that kind of a degree of independence, because having something like that is really rather nice, isn't it? And you can choose any kind of tartan or any kind of colour, except things like day glow pink is simply not allowed. Okay, no colours like that. So you have the situation, therefore, after 1736, where all these lodges are very independent. They have their own ritual, they have their own regalia, they have their own traditions, and they elect people to attend Grand Lodge. So Grand Lodge is much more of a, in Scotland, is much more of a facilitator rather than some kind of authoritarian body. I will come on a little bit later to perhaps explain what I mean by that, as if you didn't know already. Now, so we have this situation where all these lodges in Scotland don't want to join the Grand Lodge system. There's a very small number, but that means, in fact, in Scotland in the 18th century, we have two systems of masonry, if you like. We have the newfangled Grand Lodge system, working 3 degrees, granting charters or warrants to form new lodges. At the same time, the vast majority of lodges in Scotland are Stonemasons lodges, and they're in direct competition with the new system. This is the independent Stonemasons system. And it's quite clear, I think, as to why now we understand why the Stonemasons lodges wanted nothing to do with the kind of lodges that we're members of. And this is simply down to ritual. These Stonemasons lodges only had 2 degrees, the Entered Apprentice and Fellow of Craft. There was no Master Mason's degree. The 3rd degree was invented in London in the early 1720s. However, I take it we're all Master Masons here. There's no just Entered Apprentices and Fellows of Craft. We're all Master Masons. Okay, right, well, when you think about it, what the new Grand Lodge system was going to impose on these Stonemasons lodges was they had to learn the 3rd degree. And in the 3rd degree, as we all know, Fellows of Craft, which was the highest degree a stonemason could aspire to, all of a sudden they were going to be turned into murderers. That's the reason why these Stonemasons lodges wanted nothing at all to do with this newfangled Masonic system. Stonemasons in the 3rd degree were murderers, and what is more, murdered the Grand Master Hiram Abiff. And there's no way that these Stonemasons were going to join an organisation that made them out to be the worst crime that you can commit within Freemasonry. So that's the reason they stood aside, and they would have nothing to do with modern speculative Freemasonry. Now, for those of you who are familiar, I think it's within the York Rite here, there is we call it a ceremony in Scotland. It may be a degree here or not, and that's the Mark degree. For those of you who are familiar with that ceremony or degree, have a wee read at the ritual again, and for those of you that are not, it's very difficult to explain, but essentially that degree or ceremony redeems the Fellows of Craft. And once the Fellows of Craft are released from this burden of being the worst kind of criminals, they started to join the Grand Lodge of Scotland. The consequence of that was that all of a sudden we start to get operative or Stonemasons lodges joining the Grand Lodge of Scotland, but they've got no knowledge of the 3rd degree. So what the Grand Lodge of Scotland had to do is it had to form a degree team to go around Scotland teaching all its Masonic lodges how to perform the 3rd degree, because it was unknown within the Stonemasons lodges. So what's all this got to do with the United States of America, you might ask? Well, it's fairly straightforward in terms of history. In 1752, a man was initiated in a lodge in Fredericksburg by the name of George Washington. That was a Scottish lodge. And so George Washington, the first president of the United States of America, was a Scottish Freemason. Now, how that comes about is simple as this. In 1752, and the membership records held in Edinburgh and Scotland show this, in 1752 a clandestine or illegal or illegitimate lodge was founded in Fredericksburg. And we know this because all the people that are on that list are Scotsmen. And the reason why they didn't obtain a charter and why they're clandestine was, again, remember we're talking about Scots, you can see the way they were thinking. Well, if we found a lodge and we decide to get a charter, it's going to cost us 5 guineas. Now, what happens if the lodge isn't viable? What happens if the lodge folds in a little while? You know, we've wasted that money, you know. That's a very good Scottish attitude, dare I say it. So what they did was they founded a lodge, and they didn't care whether it was clandestine or not, and they waited 6 years to make sure it was definitely a goer, you know, it was definitely going to work. And after 6 years they thought, well, okay, we better get a charter and we better become legal. And that's exactly what they did. In the year 1758, George Washington's lodge was granted a charter by the Grand Lodge of Scotland. So George Washington was a Freemason from a very early stage in his life, and as a lot of us know about the life of George Washington, he was a very busy man, and although he had contact with Freemasonry, he was not a regular attender. But he certainly did come into contact with Scots, certainly during the French Indian Wars, which is 1757. He came into contact with Scots who were fighting in the various regiments that were here. And then, of course, we come to the parting of the ways, your War of Independence. And George Washington, of course, still a Freemason, was very involved in that. And of course, there were lots and lots of Scots. In fact, there's stories back home of the Scots, because they couldn't fight the English back home, they would come over here and join the Americans to fight the English here. So, and what they would actually do, I mean, again, you've got to remember, getting passage across the Atlantic cost money. So they would actually sign up for the English army, and then once they got here, desert and join the Atlantic. So they got free passage as well, you know. Eventually, the English army decided the Scots weren't much good and stopped recruiting them, certainly for this theatre of operations. Anyway, so all great fun. Then what happened was, the United States won its independence, quite rightly so, and it was decided that a new capital city was required to be built. And it was, of course, named after George Washington. So the American Civil Service couldn't build a new capital city out of lumber. I mean, at that time, that was the most natural building material here. The place was covered in forests, so it was ideal. Log cabins and all the rest of it, though, does not make a capital city. So the question was asked, where do we get stonemasons to come and build a new capital city for the United States? And the answer from George Washington was the best stonemasons in the world come from Scotland. Now, whether or not he knew this already by his connections with Scottish Freemasonry and the Scottish Lodge, we don't know. But there is no doubt that what happened was that the American Civil Service wrote to Scotland, and in fact wrote to one particular lodge, the Lodge of Journeyman Masons No. 8 in Edinburgh, and asked if they would like to emigrate to the United States to help build the capital city of this new country. And we're very fortunate that the lodge records from that period exist. And indeed, a large number of these stonemasons, Freemasons, emigrated from Edinburgh to the United States, and when they arrived, they were given a job in what is now Washington, D.C., of building a house for the president. So they must have been very flattered. Unfortunately, we can't find any evidence of this, but whether these Scottish stonemason Freemasons knew they were building a house for their fellow Scottish Freemason, we don't know, but certainly that's what they were doing. So they duly proceeded to start work on this house. But you've got to remember that these were the guys, they were at the top of the tree, they were the creme de la creme of the construction industry. They built stone buildings that were designed to last for hundreds of years. And of course, unfortunately, the American Civil Service were just a little bit impatient to get this house built quickly. George Washington was living at Mount Vernon, and it wasn't seemly for the president, the first president of the United States, to commute on horseback in the middle of winter and all the rest of it. So they wanted this house built quickly. But of course, the Scots were very, very particular, and you can see them. I see them in my mind's eye. You know, they would find a stone and they would shape it, and then they would square it, and spend ages and ages perfecting the stones, and then nah, it's not good enough, and start again, and you could see the American Civil Service going, oh, what's going on? So the Americans' civil service came up with a very simple solution. They brought a team of slaves and said to the Scots Stonemason Freemasons, here's a team of slaves, you will train them in the art of stonemasonry, and we'll get this house built for George Washington very quickly. And of course, those of you who know from your ritual, only a freeborn man can become a Freemason. And so it was impossible for these Scots to train these stonemasons, these slaves, into to becoming stonemasons, because that would have meant also making them Freemasons. Two went together. In their mind, stonemasonry, Freemasonry made no difference. So the Scots decided there was only one thing they could do. They went on strike. So the American civil servants, what the hell's going on? You know, why are you on strike? Sorry, we can't tell you, it's a secret. and it was, you know. I mean, in the history of labour disputes, this must be the weirdest. I mean, let's face it, you know, they're on strike, but they couldn't tell anybody why. A bit odd. Anyway, but you can see why they couldn't tell anybody, because that meant revealing the whole background process of being initiated, passed and raised in a Masonic lodge. To become a stonemason also meant becoming a Freemason. So they went on strike, but of course they weren't getting paid, so these Scots didn't stay on strike for very long. What they said to the American civil service was, okay, what we'll do is we'll train freeborn men, don't care what colour they are, we'll train freeborn men, but they must be freeborn, not slaves. And that's exactly what happened. They got a squad of freeborn men, and they were trained as stonemasons. They were also then initiated as Freemasons in the Masonic Lodge. So again, clearly demonstrating this connection between stonemasonry and Freemasonry. So the house was built for the president. It was finished, but unfortunately, all these problems meant that the thing was delayed, so that delayed long enough that George Washington had died in the meantime. So he never got to occupy the house that was built by his fellow Scottish Freemasons, which is rather sad. Anyway, they did finally finish the house, and you know, we know the names and all the rest of it, which is, from a historical point of view, extremely interesting. Then we come to a little bit of a kind of falling out in 1812. You may know from your history, we had a little bit of a problem between Britain and the United States. You called it free enterprise, we called it gun running. You were selling arms to Napoleon, and of course we were at war with Napoleon at the time, so we didn't like it very much. So the Brits invaded from Canada, and they got as far as Washington DC, set the city on fire, and so well had the house for George Washington been built that even although it was set afire, all that happened was the roof burnt and fell in, so that once peace was declared, all that needed to be done was the structure had to be re-roofed with timbers, new timbers, and in order to disguise the smoke and soot damage from the fire, it was whitewashed and renamed the White House. So whenever you see your president on the White House lawn making a speech of worldwide importance, just remember that the building behind him was built by Freemasons. So you can see, I think, from that this connection between stonemasonry and Freemasonry runs very deep within the Scottish Masonic psyche, and it's very difficult to separate the two even today in a modern sense, because although most of these Stonemasons lodges did eventually join the Grand Lodge of Scotland, in fact the last one to do so was the lodge at Melrose, the guy from John Coburn, who'd come here way back in 1680. 200 years later it was until when his lodge finally decided to join the Grand Lodge of Scotland. It joined in 1891. So you can see that being an independent Stonemasons lodge was something that these lodges held dear and precious and held on to for dear life. There are still approximately 6 Masonic lodges, that is lodges under the Grand Lodge of Scotland, which are called Operative Lodges, and which seek to recruit stonemasons only. Nowadays, of course, unfortunately, the craft of stonemasonry is so small that they've had to widen their net, if you like, and they now take members from the construction industry, regardless of whether they're stonemasons or not. So you can see from that, I think, that this trait of Freemasonry, this kind of Freemasonry in a Scottish sense, is very different. This air of independence that we have from our regalia to our ritual to our dealings with Grand Lodge is very profound. Now, to skip on to the next part, if you like, and we'll not keep you terribly long because I don't want to get thrown out into the heat of the night, so to speak. There are three books or three texts that Freemasons can refer to for practically any situation. They are the Constitution and Laws, or the rules and regulations under which the Lodge is erected under the Grand Lodge. There is the volume of the Sacred Law, and there is the Ritual. So there are three works of reference that every Freemason can refer to for practically any situation within Freemasonry. When I ask people which one would you automatically pick up to examine first for any problem, nearly everyone says the Constitution and Laws of the Grand Lodge of Arizona or whatever. In Scotland, the answer invariably is the Ritual. And the reason for that is the Grand Lodge of Scotland and the lodges under it did not have any rules and regulations whatsoever until 1836. So for 100 years, it relied on only two texts, the volume of the Sacred Law, the Bible, and the Ritual. And the Ritual, if you read it, contains pretty much everything you actually need to know about what to do and act as a Freemason. I think, unfortunately, we kind of forget that often. Now, so here we have the situation in Scotland where, with no rules and regulations at all, the Grand Lodge of Scotland doesn't have any, how did Freemasonry function? Well, the simple answer is that lodges in Scotland are independent sovereign bodies in their own right. In other words, the power of Scottish Freemasonry lies with the lodges, not with the Grand Lodge. The Grand Lodge is an advisory body. It attempts to facilitate, educate, help, assist. It does not dictate, it does not determine what lodges can and cannot do. Lodges determine that for themselves. And common sense dictates that they will not do ridiculous things. They are filled with grown adult males who are allowed to exercise their common sense. So the Grand Lodge of Scotland, if you were in I suspect if you were in a lodge in, well, I don't suspect, I know, but if you were in a lodge in England and a letter from the Grand Lodge of England arrives, the secretary of the lodge will read it out and it says something like, from Monday, this lodge will do this and it will do that, it will raise its fees, it will do this, that, the next thing, or else. That's the hidden subtext, or else we'll take your charter away. In Scotland, if you hear a correspondence read from the Grand Lodge of Scotland, it reads something like this. The lodge might like to think about implementing a suggested idea that was discussed in one of the committees some time ago, but you don't have to do it, of course, but we think it's a pretty good idea. So you get the impression of what happens. The effect of that means that Scottish lodges have a huge disparity in the way they do things. We even have different officers, we call them office bearers. So Scottish lodges can elect different office bearers. Once they've elected office bearers, the duties of the office bearers can be different from one lodge to another. Even things like booze. Scottish lodges have the right to sell alcohol in its lodges, and it always has. In fact, some of the famous paintings from the 17th century, alcohol is a very central, picturesque part of the image. Scottish Freemasonry probably would cease to exist overnight if we stopped selling booze. So, a secondary income for Scottish lodges. That's the way it's always been. It's a different culture, of course. We're talking about two completely different countries. So when we look, and I'm not an expert on American Freemasonry, but knowing what I know about Scottish Freemasonry, what does surprise me a little bit, and this is merely an impression I have from looking outside in, so to speak, that here we have a situation where a lot of my Masonic forebears left Scotland in order to get away from dictatorial, non-representative forms of government, non-representative forms of religion, to attain freedom of expression. And the craft which I love so dearly here has exactly that attribute that we're trying to escape from 300 and 400 years ago. And I kind of find that it's strange that in the world's most powerful democracy, this craft of ours doesn't have that level of democracy within it. And so it's kind of bizarre for someone like me to come from the old world to the new and find remnants of the old world we all ran away from hundreds of years ago still alive and well here. So that is the point of controversy that I better safely end on. If I've got a completely wrong impression, my apologies. But anyway, thank you very much for listening. I hope that you found that to be of some interest, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Okay, thank you. So,
I've got one, John.
no, somebody.
The Grand Lodge is up to me again.
So how are new lodges formed in Scotland? In this country, it goes through another lodge and 15 brothers, and then the Grand Lodge gives them a dispensation, and then they form a charter, and we actually just formed a lodge, brand new.
Yeah.
How are new lodges formed in Scotland?
Yeah, things have become a lot more formal now, and that's pretty much the same across the world, I think. But in previous years, George Washington's lodge was known as a self-starter. There was, I mean, think about it, it was a long, long way away to get the charter, apart from the
So
cost.
would you say that's probably the most important task that the Grand Lodge does in Scotland, is form new lodges?
No, I don't think that at all. In fact, I think that's probably one of the least important things, because lodges pre-existed the Grand Lodge of Scotland, so we don't need a Grand Lodge to have lodges.
Does the Scottish Rite in your part of the world have a philanthropy that they support?
The short answer is no. The Scottish Rite is very different in my country. It's only been around 150 years, so it's seen to be a kind of Johnny-come-lately organisation in many ways. So it's and membership is by invitation only. I'm only an 18th degree Mason. I'm probably very unlikely ever to be anything greater than that. So it's a very different organisation than from here in the United States. There's only 9 33rd degree Masons. There are no honorary 33rd degree Masons, so 9 and 9 only. When one dies, another one is elected. So any of the degrees from 4 to 32 are, as I say, by invitation only. I'm not an expert, but they do certainly contribute substantially to charities, but they tend to rotate the philanthropy they're looking at. They don't concentrate on one. They try and spread it throughout society.
Does the agents, they call it the agent accepted right there, are they under the agent accepted right ones in Duke Street, or do they have?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the ancient, free and accepted, or accept.
The agent accepted.
Ancient and accepted. Yes, there's two ways of describing.
We call it the Scottish Rite.
Yeah.
It's under the
Yeah.
Street.
Yeah.
Does Scotland have their own line?
Yeah. I mean, because it's called the Scottish Rite. In order to make it clear what it is in Scotland, it's called the Scottish Rite for Scotland. That is, see, I know it's kind of odd, but whereas in France it would be the Scottish Rite for France, say, or something like that. So it's to make it clear that the Scottish Rite for Scotland is what it is, and of course it's a very independent body. It was not formed from the Southern jurisdiction, for example.
When I was in Edinburgh
visiting, I went into a pub, and there was a Masonic emblem in the pub. And I'm questioning this because at the time I wondered about it then. This was probably 25 years ago. But I noticed that there was a square and there was a compass, but I didn't notice any G.
Mm-hmm.
Is this common then with Scottish Mason?
No, we have a problem in the sense that Scotland is part of the same landmass as England. The two countries are actually very different in terms of their history and culture. But the English removed the letter G from the square and compasses many years ago. Scotland never did. So when you see the square and compasses, you'll know it's of English origin, and it's in Scotland in error, if you like. It should always have the G. Yeah.
It was in London when we first landed in London.
Right.
And it was like in Prince Arrow Rose or something like that. And it really stood out because that's one of the first things I recognized when I attended there. I was up in Scotland and I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, good.
At your particular building.
Yeah,
Thank
okay.
Sir.
Yeah.
Good evening, my name is Jim Reed. How would a 32nd degree Mason be accepted in Lodge a 32nd degree Mason from here be accepted in Lodge in Scotland?
Short answer is he wouldn't. He would not, no. Because there's no connection between the Scottish Rite and Masonic lodges.
Now, would a 3rd degree Mason?
Yes.
So I could attend the Lodge as a 3rd degree, but not 32nd?
Yeah, exactly. They would simply not understand what a 32nd degree Mason was.
Thank you. By the way, thank you for coming, and
okay, my pleasure.
appreciate your time.
Okay.
Bob, for identification, where did the Scottish Rite originate in Scotland?
No, it didn't originate in Scotland. It probably originated in France, went to the Caribbean, and then was translated to South Carolina. However, research at the moment seems to suggest that it was Scots in France that established the Scottish Rite before, or the elements of the Scottish Rite that we recognise now. That's ongoing research, and I really don't know too much about it, but it may well have been people who were followers of Bonnie Prince Charlie and his family who were in France who were responsible for creating what became known as the Scottish Rite. But that's at the moment, that's very much ongoing work, ongoing research.
Well, James Michael Ramsey, when he gave his famous speech before the Grand Lodge of France, he started the whole building, although he himself don't recognize. But he was a Scotsman.
Yes.
I remember what's going on.
Exactly. I mean, for those of you who want sort of names to think about, there are 3 that immediately spring to mind. James Anderson, who wrote the first constitutions for the Grand Lodge of England in 1723, was a Scotsman, a Presbyterian minister actually, from Aberdeen. And he was a member of the same lodge, or his father, I should say, was a member of the same lodge as John Skene, who came to the United States in 1680. You begin to see the connections all the way through this. So James Anderson's father was a member of the lodge in Aberdeen. He was the guy that actually wrote the minutes where John Skene is recorded being a member. So he's the first guy. What's interesting about, he's writing the constitutions for the first Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge of England. But anyone who reads it carefully will probably find what I find a very amusing one-liner that he slips in as a Scotsman. You've got to remember who's paying to have this written, the Grand Lodge of England. But he slips in a one-liner that says, in simple as this, of course, pure Freemasonry was preserved in Scotland, end quote. So you get, in other words, you say, yeah, I'm writing the history for the Grand Lodge of England, but by the way, guys, true Freemasonry existed in Scotland, not here. And then the third, so that's the first one. The second one, as you mentioned, is Chevalier Ramsay, Andrew Ramsay from Ayrshire. This humble man, son of a baker, becomes a chevalier, a knight of the Order of Lazarus, And he gives this very famous oration suggesting that Freemasonry originated during the Crusades. So that's the second Scotsman. The third one to mention, not so well known perhaps, is William Preston, who wrote lots of Masonic lectures. He was born in Edinburgh, but was very much an English Freemason. So here you have three extremely important and three extremely influential Freemasons who shaped Freemasonry, I think, as we know it today. But the significant thing is, not one of these three are peddling their particular view of Freemasonry in Scotland. They are telling the world about Freemasonry in England and in France, but they're not telling it in Scotland because they knew darn well they'd get found out. They were giving a view of Freemasonry that Scotland just simply wouldn't recognise. Sorry, yeah.
How much of your research were you able to do on the United States Freemason organization, early organization, from Scotland? Were there duplicate records kept in Scotland, or did you have to come to the Americas to research it?
Yeah, it's one of these rather odd situations where you kind of stumble across information by mistake when you're looking for something else. And I was looking through the Lodge of Journeyman Masons number 8's records, trying to find the name for a genealogical inquiry it would receive. Somebody was trying to find it out whether an ancestor had been a Freemason or not. And I came across these entries in the treasurer's book for the lodge where there were names that had been written in, and he'd ruled off this ledger, and they paid their annual dues every 3 months, 6 pennies every 3 months. And this treasurer had very meticulously was recording how much every member had paid. And then you can see almost in a temper, he'd scored out some names with a quill pen, and underneath he's got "gone to America." He can't collect the 6 pennies anymore because the guy's not around. So, but this treasurer kept that record going for years. So although the guy wasn't in Scotland anymore, this treasurer's keeping a track of the fact that he wasn't paying the money anymore. So when he came back, he was, "Oh, that you owe me £10 now, not just shillings, it's pounds." So when I found that, I said, well, why record the fact that they'd gone to America? What's significant with that? And I was in Washington, D.C. when I went to the White House, and I picked up the official guide, and they mentioned that Scots had been involved in the building. So a little bit more digging, then we found the names of the Scots, and what's more, so we got the names of the known Scots that were there way back in the 1790s, and then we'll look at the names in the lodge records, and the names are the same. Then Harry S. Truman, president, past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge in Missouri. In the 1950s, he remodeled the White House. I think it was the 1950s, and he stripped it right down to the foundation stones, and he found all these stones had a mason's mark on them. And the mason's mark, of course, is all that's on the stone. No name, but a mason's mark. So we got photographs of all these stones from the White House, then went to the mark book of the lodge, and next to the person's name is a mark. So the mason's mark is taken by the person to the United States of America, and when he carves a stone, he puts his mark on it. And it's recorded in the mark book in Edinburgh, and it's the same mark on the stone. So we know the stone and the name of the guy that carved it. Now, what you might find interesting is that Harry Truman sent these stones to every Grand Lodge in the United States and very many other Masonic orders, Masonic bodies. Most of them have now been brought back together, and they're on exhibit with the mark book from Edinburgh, from the Lodge of Edinburgh, and they're on display in the George Washington Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia, at this moment. Yeah, it's an amazing piece of history. It really is. Yeah.
So you're saying the White House was torn down and rebuilt under Truman?
Yeah, he did some remodeling work. I don't know exactly what.
Right down to the foundation?
Yeah, he was very, he did. I mean, there's photographs of the time. I mean, he kind of ripped the place apart. Yeah, he really did, but yeah. Yeah.
What would be a difficult task to go through the 29 degrees from the 4th to the 32nd? Is there a difference?
If you're dedicated, 15 years. Yeah. I'll 15, yeah. I'll never do it. I'll never do it in my lifetime.
There's no waiting period between degrees, in other words.
Yeah, there is, but it's not a written period. It's by invitation. So, and that could be 2 years, 5 years, depending on just how you're perceived to be as a Freemason.
Robert, I have a question.
Sure.
Rosslyn Chapel. Is there any connection between Rosslyn Chapel and Freemasonry?
Really spoke about it.
Yeah, yeah. It's, I can recognize a bear trap when I hear one. Let me put it this way. I think part of the problem comes down to definition. When you read a lot of books, they say Masons built Rosslyn Chapel, and so certainly within companies such as this, when you say Masons built Rosslyn Chapel, there's only one conclusion you can automatically come to, and Masons means Freemasons. But of course, it wasn't Freemasons that built Rosslyn Chapel, it was Stonemasons. So when you remember that, and the fact that at that time there is no obvious connection between stonemasonry and what we now know to be Freemasonry, then there is no connection. What there might be is a kind of reflection from what we know today as to what they were doing in places like Rosslyn Chapel. But in many ways, Rosslyn Chapel is not unique, because there are many other buildings like that in Scotland, maybe not quite so profuse in terms of the carvings, but there are other churches and chapels with all sorts of what you would consider to be Masonic within them, but they're not considered to be Masonic buildings. So it's a very difficult question to answer to any great degree of satisfaction, because we've all got our own opinions, but personally I don't think there is any connection. Yeah, it was a good tour.
Story in Alexandria, Virginia, is that what you're saying?
I'm sorry?
You have the whole story's in Alexandria.
No, it's at the White House. You take the White House tour.
Yeah.
They'll tell you all about the history of the building.
Yeah, it's a good
Now,
tour.
if you want to go to the monument in Alexandria, that's a Masonic effort put together by the then 50 or so Grand Lodges of the U.S. I guess there might have been 50 by that. That building was built back in the 30s.
Yeah, I think it's just celebrated its 100th anniversary, if I'm not mistaken.
Different process. But if you want to know about White House renovations, I think the thing to do is next time you're in Washington, see if you can get signed up for the White House tour. You probably get more than you wanted to know.
Yeah, I think there's history online as well. Yeah.
Today, as of like a year and a half ago, you want to take a tour of the White House. You have to be a senator or a congressman in order to get you in there. So my question is, the Scottish Rite is there. Do we have a little pull? We can get to the big guy.
I'm not the guy to answer for the pull of the Scottish Rite. I'm inclined to be skeptical. Oh, by the way, the question earlier about that my friend asked about visiting the ancient accepted rite in other countries. There is a protocol for, you may be allowed to visit and you may be accepted for visiting purposes, a 32nd or whatever you are in the Scottish Rite here. But were you to try to join over there, you would certainly not be accepted as a 32nd degree Mason. I don't know exactly where they would put you. There's treaties in Washington that they have with the other Supreme Councils around the world that define that. But the rest of the world, quite frankly, goes a little squirrely when they hear how we pass out degrees in the Scottish Rite in this country. I've had the same experience as Bob. I was at a dinner in New Zealand some years ago. We had some visiting New Zealanders, and we were talking about Scottish Rite. I was with a Masonic group, and we were just having dinner conversation, and I asked, how many 33rd degree Scottish Rite members are there for the country of New Zealand? The answer was 5. And I looked at the table and I said, we have more than that here from the States. Their eyes, of course, began to roll.
Yep.
One of the things I'd like to add to that is that if someone from Europe wants to become a Scottish Rite Mason while visiting the United States, they cannot.
Really?
That's right. They can only do it. They can become a 3rd degree Mason here, but they can't be a Scottish Rite Mason unless they become a citizen. That's to not infect the Europeans.
Is there another one here?
Yes, I wanted to, just a quick question in regards to the current lodges in Scotland. What % of them actually have active stonemasons?
Not an awful lot, I have to say. The construction industry has changed beyond all recognition. You know, it's all steel and concrete and glass now. So the actual number of stonemasons as a trade is very small. So what happens is that there's six, certainly six, and the Lodge of Journeyman Masons number 8 in Edinburgh is one of them. What they try and do is they try and recruit candidates from the construction industry rather than just stonemasons. They have to do that in order to survive, basically. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that the ritual for the Scottish Court Blue Lodges contain everything you need to know, which would also include their bylaws or the governing right. Is that still true today? And is that ritual coded, or is it written in a clear text? In what language?
Well, the first thing is that in terms of, I mean, it's a philosophical observation, if you like, that the ritual contains everything you really need to know as a Freemason. The problem is that it's a lot easier to pick up a plain English text that tells you in a certain situation, the Grand Lodge tells you this is what you do. So that's why nowadays we tend not to look at the ritual, which is in some ways rather sad. So that's why we tend to concentrate on the Grand Lodge rules and regulations. It's the same in Scotland now, sadly. Although in some ways that's changing as people begin to realise that that was originally all there was nothing else. And the second part of your question was coded. Again, that depends very much on the lodge. We don't have to be quite so cautious in Scotland. I mean, there are 660 lodges, and certainly every single lodge, although it might have a similar ritual to another lodge, there will be substantial differences within it. So, I mean, I think you have a system of district deputies here that make the lodges conform to the standard ritual of the state. Well, you can imagine in Scotland trying to make 660 lodges with different rituals conform is just not it's nigh impossible. So it's not so essential for the lodge ritual to be coded. Having said that, some lodges have their ritual printed in full, but that's because they're the only lodge that has that ritual. Other lodges have no ritual printed whatsoever, and you have to go to the past master's house and be taught mouth to ear to learn the different offices. So if you want to learn the senior warden's part, say, then you'll have to spend many nights attending a past master's house in order to learn that lodge's ritual, because it's not written down at all. So from one extreme to the other.
Are the number of Masons increasing in Scotland or decreasing?
Yeah, they're increasing in Scotland. I think we've now had the fifth net increase in succession. But having said that, I think it's important to remember that in Scotland, the decline in membership, or the decline certainly since the heyday after the Second World War, is not seen as a decline. And I particularly don't like that word. I personally, and remember, I should have said this right at the very beginning, nearly everything, in fact, no, I better say everything that I've said tonight is purely personal opinion. Otherwise I could be, you know. Sorry, could you refresh my memory, just the particular point you were...
The numbers, are they increasing?
Yeah, the word, yeah, I don't, as I said, I don't like the word decline. What we're doing in Scotland, certainly, in my opinion, is getting back to normal. And that is because you have to decide where you're taking your start point. Now, that everywhere in the Masonic world, the high point was in the 50s and 60s, where we had a huge intake, a generation that had fought during the Second World War. They came home, the guys came home, and the numbers just went sky high. Now, if you take that as your start point, then we are certainly in decline, numerically in decline from there. But we're fortunate in Scotland that our membership records go back to 1599. So when you pick a date, 1650, 1750 or 1850, we're doing very well, thank you very much. Depends on where you choose your date to start from. Okay. All right, John, we tired them enough.
You think you tired them out?
Well, I hope so.
Anybody got any more questions? One more time.
Is there an email address that we could contact you if we wanted to communicate?
Oh dear. Yes, of course there is. Of course there is. Yes, we can certainly supply that. That's not a problem. You can get it from the Grand Lodge of Scotland website as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Robert.
Give me my card.
Yeah, I will. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.